Later restaurant. 3 weeks later. Restaurant in Kumo. That's it Amoy. Ya see that lollipop of yours? It's going straight up your ass. Stop it Karu. My butt will hurt, which will affect my ability to move. What happens if we're on a mission where we are attacked by mutated bears and we need to run away? Do you really want me to Shut up. She hollered with trembling fists and rising rage. Shut up, shut up, shut up. Shut up 1,000 times over. If you keep talking, you won't have to worry about mutated bears, because I'll be the one killing you. It was a peaceful day in Kumagakure, that was as normal as any other. That is if you ignored the bickering children. The two children who seemed to be arguing were none other than Amoy and Karu, the same kids who Naruto had met with 3 weeks prior to today. They could be found in the outside seating area of a simple restaurant, arguing beside the small garden area along the side. The children were not alone, however, as 2 women could be seen seated not far from their war zone. One was an alabaster-skinned, blonde-haired beauty with piercing blue eyes that could send a chill down any man's spine. Whether this was caused by her stoic expressions or her alluring gaze was uncertain. She had a figure that boasted curves that many would deem difficult to find, even if they searched across the nations, that is, if you ignored the familiar-faced woman seated across from her. This woman was an ebony goddess that was not inferior to the pale-skinned woman before her. In terms of superficial appearance, they could not be any more different, but their figures were nearly the same. Her light gray hair was held in a bun that showed the captivating contours of her neck and collarbone. And her green eyes displayed an element of elegance and maturity not commonly found in females of her age group. Her dark skin was a sight to behold and was smooth beyond measure. There was not a scar, nor imperfection in sight, which often left many to question if she was truly a shinobi or not. When one looked at the 2 women, they would recognize that they were delicacies of different kinds, but charming all the same. Mabu was more refined and mature in behavior and appearance, while Samu was more sexy and cool in attitude and the way she carried herself. There was a silence between these unearthly beauties as they watched the altercation between the fiery-haired and hot-tempered Karu, and the snow-haired, paranoid boy that was Amoy. This continued for a few moments before the blonde woman let out a deep sigh in exasperation. How uncool, she muttered lowly before turning to the gray-haired woman. Forgive me, Mabu. I couldn't just leave them alone, especially when they get like this. Mabu just shook her head lightly with a small smile gracing her face. I don't mind, Samu. Who knows what would happen if they were left on their own. She released a small giggle as she watched Karu begin to grab at Amoy's hair as he continued to spurt out more random tales of paranoia. It's nice to see that not much has changed since we last met. Mabu then examined Amoy a little more carefully. Though the lollipop is new, I could have sworn he said it would risk giving him cavities and many other ridiculous reasons. So seeing him with one is a bit surprising to say the least. She then cast Samu a curious gaze. What changed his mind? Samu then allowed a small upturn of her lips to appear, making Mabu raise her brow in curiosity. Whatever happened, it certainly must have been interesting for her to smile, even if it was a small one. They met with an interesting character. Of course, the person Samu was referring to was none other than Naruto, who was disguised as Narukami. When Naruto had first met up with Amoy and Karu, they failed to notice that there had been someone else who had been observing them from afar, and this person was none other than Samu herself. She was well aware of how Amoy and Karu acted, and knew they would be late for training, as they always had. Whenever she found them, they were either arguing or fighting, and much to her dismay, it was always in public. So it wasn't too hard for her to find the 2 when she heard Karu's shouts echo through the village like some sort of shrilly banshee that was at death's door. Before she could put a stop to it, however, she saw a masked figure move towards them, which prompted her to take caution. From the mask and blue hair, she was able to recognize who the man was right away, as any shinobi who was worth their salt should. It was required to keep tabs on famous shinobi, whether they be bad or good with their intentions. His unexpected appearance was suspicious to her, but she had no idea what he would have wanted with her charges. She was not like the Reikage or her brother Atsu, who just charged headstrong and hot-headed into dangerous situations. She opted to wait silently in the background and listen to their conversation while out of sight. This was not a difficult task for her due to her calm and collected demeanor, but it also helped that her young teammates were distracting the masked mercenary by agitating him. Among her set of skills, stealth and strategy was her greatest, since she did not leak killing intent and maintained a countenance of indifference and neutrality. This allowed her to assess situations more accurately and work smoothly even under pressure. As she watched over her charges and the masked shinobi, she had to restrain a giggle that wanted to escape her lips. The constant jabs at the mercenary's sexual preference and appetite was comedic, and she was sure she could feel the man's brow twitching behind the mask. What caught her attention about the man, however, was his words towards Amoy, as well as the impression he left on him. His words moved her. They were simple to understand, yet deep. She had tried on more than one occasion to convince Amoy to loosen up, but it was to no avail. He was a natural worrywart, so her and Karu had eventually given up on trying to change his ways. But after hearing Narukami's words, she could tell something shifted in Amoy that day. While he was still paranoid about a great many things, she could tell that he is different from the way he was before. This was further evidenced by how he would always be found with a lollipop in his mouth since meeting with the masked mercenary. She had even asked what Amoy thought of him, and to her shock he said, "He's a cool guy. If I had a brother, I imagine it would be someone like him." A brother, she mused. Imagining someone to a familial extent was not something to be taken lightly. After a single meeting, he was able to gain the admiration of someone she saw as a younger brother, and even managed to do something she nor Karu could do. Hell, he had even gotten on Karu's good side, and all it took was ramen. How he knew the fiery-haired kunoichi would love that unhealthy dish escaped her. This kind of ability was strange, at best, and terrifying at worst. Despite this, even she found herself interested in the man after seeing his interaction with Amoy and Karu. She continued to watch from afar even as they entered a ramen shop, and she could see that he was a man that was kind, powerful, if the rumors were anything to go by, and good with children. She was certain he would make a good father. When she thought that, she froze and shook her head from the idea. She didn't know where that thought came from, but she wouldn't lose her mind over it. She just considered it a passing thought and opted to ignore it for the time being. Returning from her inner musings, she looked to Mabu with a small smile and said, "I'll admit he was a pretty cool guy." At that, Mabu's eyes had widened a little, knowing exactly what this meant. Someone actually caught Samu's attention? And it was a guy, she thought, before deciding to voice her curiosity. It was no mystery that Samu was one of the famous ice queens of Kumagakure, with Mabu herself included. They were famous for being top-tier women who rejected all men who approached them, yet she found someone who could grab her attention? Cool, you say. He must be something to make even you interested in them. Hearing this, Samu could only shake her head, understanding what Mabu was getting at. I don't mean it in that way, Mabu. He just seems like a man of many talents. The way he carries himself is mature, collected, and cool. There it is again, Mabu said inwardly. The term cool was a very high evaluation for Samu, and it has been said more than once about the same person in a single conversation. This only served to make Mabu even more curious about who this mysterious character was. But the fact that Samu hasn't stated the person's name yet and has been very vague about who they were was very telling. Whoever it was, it seems like she wanted to keep it a secret. But why? So how has your secret training been coming along, Mabu? Ah, so that's why, thought Mabu, finally coming to a realization. Samu made it no secret that she was curious about Mabu's training. Before she started meeting with Narukami, she had been hanging out with Samu a few times. They had already made plans, and she was the reason why training had been pushed back a bit. Though Mabu wanted to tell her what it was, all she could mention was that she would be meeting with someone for private training by order of the Raikage. While Samu was a bit put off, she understood how close Mabu was to the Raikage, so she didn't try to pick at the issue. But it would seem that she is trying to trade secrets with her, in an effort to find out more about this training she was going through. Mabu decided it would be alright to humor her a bit, considering the technique she and Narukami developed was completed. She just hadn't reported to the Raikage yet. It went well, Samu. In fact, we finished training today, so I should be a bit more free from now on. Raising a brow slightly, Samu asked, "Finished? What was it you worked on?" Well, we were working on developing a new technique, and I have to say it is much more amazing than I anticipated. Surprisingly, it was easy for him to create it since it only took a week. The hard part was training me to use it since it required high reserves and good focus. While this was all interesting to Samu, she was aware by how vague Mabu was being that she couldn't divulge the nature of the jutsu that had been developed, so she opted to target the next best thing. Him, she responded slyly, with Mabu gaining a slightly reddish hue on her face after realizing her mistake. So your trainer was a man then? I was wondering why you couldn't meet with me so often. You also seem to be in a happier mood nowadays, and it turns out that it's because of a guy. Mabu just shook her head in response. It's not like that, Samu. He was just helping me out was all. Samu's brow rose once more after noticing that the light dusting of red on her face didn't seem to be going away. It seems there was more to this training of hers than she initially thought. Is that so, then, why are you blushing? Mabu just turned her head to the side in slight embarrassment as the redness seemed to darken more at Samu's words. Geez, leave it alone, Samu. Ignoring her remark, Samu continued in a teasing manner, it seems I'm not the only one who's had an interesting meeting. She then leaned her cheek onto her palm and sent Mabu a light smirk. Not to mention you've been with each other for a few weeks now, she went on to say, while trailing off the end of her sentence in a playfully suspicious manner. Mabu's face became nearly as red as Karu's hair once that was said. She rose from her chair and leaned her chest over the table with an abashed expression. It wasn't like that. I mean, yeah, he was very kind and smart and we did get along well. As she drawled on, her voice became meeker and meeker every time she mentioned one Naruto's better traits, until she realized what it was she was saying. Wait, stop making me say these things. It's nothing like you are thinking. We just had good chemistry and similar interests. While Mabu was usually calm and mature, that didn't mean she couldn't become flustered. She was only 17, so there were still some things she found embarrassing and could get her riled up. The same could be said about Samu, but she was much more skilled in controlling it. Samu just shook her head and giggled lightly. Sorry Mabu, I think it's cool you found someone you have good chemistry with. Mabu just gave up on retorting and decided to sit back in her chair with a slight pout on her face and looked to the side with a blush still crossing her cheeks. Geez, if you're going to keep teasing me, I should just leave. It was then Mabu realized what time it was and her eyes opened wide slightly. Oh, I really do need to leave. She then turned to Samu with an apologetic expression and continued, sorry Samu. But I need to meet with the Raikage. He's been waiting for an update on the technique I've been working on, and now that it's finished, I need to make a report. Samu just waved her off with a light smile. It's all right. Be sure to give me the details about this jutsu of yours when the Raikage says you can. Okay. Mabu just nodded her head and sent her a wave of her own before moving in the direction of Raikage Tower. Once Mabu was a fair distance away, Samu spoke loud enough for her to hear, and say hi to your trainer for me. Samu. Stop it. Kumagakure Hotel. The sun was beginning to set, marking the transition from late afternoon to early evening. In one particular room of a hotel in Kumagakure, a lone, red-haired figure could be found in the center of the room, seated with legs crossed on the floor with a solemn expression. Beside him lay his mask and dozens of papers regarding various seals and formulas he had been going through with Mabu over the past 3 weeks. One would think he would be a little more spirited considering his recent success in creating a new jutsu with Mabu, but his thoughts were now swarming through several other subjects at the moment. The reason for his current mood was the scroll in his hands that he had in possession for a little over 5 years now. It was a white scroll with the character for Kami in black. It was currently open and unfurled enough for him to read the title this scroll beheld. It was a name similar to the Uzumaki scroll he had opened while living in Uzushiogakure, but with one difference. It read, Scroll of Origin Foundation of Yang. What made this scroll different from the other scroll other than its general appearance, however, was the content within. No matter how many times Naruto looked, it always appeared the same blank. Other than the name of the scroll, there was nothing else within. It did not matter if he unfurled it to the end of the scroll, the result was always the same nothing. When he had first released the scroll from its seal, it was only 2 years after he had unlocked the first. While he was initially excited, that was immediately turned into feelings of distraught once he looked inside. It did not bother him now, however, as he knows the reason why the scroll was empty, and would remain so. Yang release, he muttered lowly under his breath. Indeed, the only reason why he couldn't unlock the scroll was because he lacked talent in Yang release. No, it wasn't that he lacked the talent for Yang release. If that were true, he would not have been able to unlock the scroll in the first place. In fact, he would have never made it through the sealed doors that held the scrolls, let alone the scrolls themselves. The reason was simple to understand, yet an issue that has been insurmountable and exceedingly difficult to conquer since he first began training. And quite ironically, the reason for his diminished talent in Yang release was its polar opposite, yet complementary force. Yin release, he muttered under his breath quietly, but if one paid attention, they would notice a hint of aggravation and irritation in his voice. Yin and Yang opposite, yet complementary forces. They represented the order of all things and could be applied to many, if not all things in the universe. There could be no light without dark. There was no heat without the cold. There was no day without night. As polar opposite these things were, they could not exist without the other. There was a balance to these things. There was a balance to all things, and that is where Naruto made his mistake. Throughout his years in training, Naruto spent a majority of his time on the typical taijutsu and bukijutsu arts, as well as seals and yin release jutsu. One may think that this wasn't a lot, and if they did, they truly underestimated how difficult of an art the last two were. Naruto was required to build his yin jutsu from scratch, and sealing itself was a science that escaped the knowledge of a large majority of the shinobi in the elemental nations. The art was vast and complex, and not something that could be taught within a day. With that being said, Naruto had forgotten the importance of balance between these two particular elements, and it came at a heavy price. Yin release was an element that practiced the darker aspects of jutsu, where yang release practiced more into the light. Because there was no order between light and dark when he trained, Naruto found that he himself was starting to become darker as a result. His thoughts became more sinister. His actions became crueler. And any semblance of remorse or regret for his actions were non-existent. The only reason he was able to maintain a more positive outlook was due to the people he surrounded himself with, and his own ability to suppress thoughts and emotions. But despite all this, he was beginning to hear the occasional whispers of malicious thoughts and evil intents that began to frighten him. He did not want to allow this to progress any further, otherwise who knows what he might become. Soon, I'll be able to conquer this darkness inside of me, he thought as he focused his attention towards the falls of truth. Now that he had completed his first promise towards the Raikage, he could now turn his focus towards his most pressing issue. He had heard rumors of how the falls allowed one to face themselves, and by conquering this tribulation, they would be able to achieve new heights in training and ability. Naruto decided to put the thoughts regarding yin and yang release aside for now and sealed the scrolls back onto the storage seals on his arms. He then looked around for a moment, then sighed. He was alone in the room for now since he had sent Sai and Karin to gather supplies for their journey to Genbu, the island turtle. He didn't want to reveal the existence of the scrolls in front of them. This was not because he didn't trust them, but because of the risk that one would bear once they had knowledge of its existence. It was dangerous enough that they possessed some knowledge of the true talent that lies within all Uzumaki. He would be alone for a couple more hours, so he decided to enter meditation. With legs crossed and the back of his hands resting against his knees, and proceeded to enter a meditative state that was different from others. Naruto preferred to call it void meditation, or the void state. Most meditation techniques required one to bond with nature or their surroundings, but his meditation did the exact opposite. In an effort to understand the void technique that had been applied to him when he first entered Uzashigakure, he developed a way to embrace it in its entirety. At first, he had been frightened by the void, but now, he basked in it. Why was this the case? Well, because he found that if it were used in smaller, temporary doses, it served to be very effective and powerful in many ways. In the void state, you erased all of your senses. Touch, smell, taste, hearing, sight. All that you were allowed was the ability to think. This would normally be a frightening experience, but Naruto had found that by erasing the senses, you were able to bring your ability to think to greater heights. Naruto had developed many techniques and complex seals, but was all of that really possible with pure ability alone? Not exactly. There were many distractions in the world, whether you acknowledge it or not. By using this meditative state, Naruto was able to develop ideas and theories at a rate that was exceedingly faster than he ever would have, even when you considered his natural talent. The biggest downside to this state, however, was vulnerability. You erased any sense you had to perceive your surroundings and others, which left you open for anything, really. As Naruto slowly drowned himself in this state of nothingness, his thoughts reflected back to his most recently created jutsu. It was his greatest pride, and the jutsu he felt that allowed him to reach a level that could contend with the likes of Minato, and the other cages. And if this did not put him on equal footing, he felt he had surpassed them. The Crossing Heavens Jutsu. Raikage Tower. And that is it for my report, Lord Raikage. 2 figures could be found in the cage office area in the tower presently. The first was Mabu, who had come to report to the Raikage about the success of the recently developed Crossing Heavens Jutsu after her brief outing with Samu and her team. And of course, the other figure was none other than the leader of Kumagakure himself. After Mabu finished her report, she let out a sigh of content. She was truly happy with the results of her training, and she now found her battle capability has risen to new heights. This technique alone granted her overwhelming evasive ability, as well as significant improvement in tactical maneuvering and position placement. Not to mention it was also ideal for assassination. She was still a greenhorn in its usage however, and she required much more practice before it could be used effectively. But the potential alone was staggering and would help solidify her position as a threatening shinobi. The Raikage himself currently had a grin so wide, it practically split his face. He was in a good, no a great mood. And why shouldn't he be? He was now in possession of a technique he thought surpassed even the great Hiraishin. Ha ha ha. This is great, Mabu. He shouted with excited fervor, as he proceeded to hug Mabu with all the strength he could muster. Mabu's face was now flushed red. Not out of embarrassment but due to lack of air. Uncle A can't breathe. Realizing his mistake, A released Mabu from his grip and backed away with his hands on his hips. Ahaha, forgive me Mabu. You know how emotion-driven I am, so I couldn't help myself. I wish you would control yourself more though, she thought to herself. She really did love her uncle but she could live without his unpredictable temper tantrums and emotional roller coaster of moods. Not being able to hold back his curiosity, A asked without hesitation, so Mabu do you think I would be able to learn this technique of yours? Mabu tensed a bit at the question, but relaxed a moment later. She knew this would come up. Who wouldn't want to mass-produce such a powerful technique? Unfortunately she would have to be the bearer of bad news. Sorry uncle but this is a jutsu only myself and Narukami are capable of. At that, A's brow twitched a bit in irritation. So the brat knows it too, huh, I suppose it was too much to hope he wouldn't, he thought. It was troubling to know there was someone else out there who possessed such a powerful technique but he figured this would be the case. At least he had someone who also knew the technique inside out, making it easier to counter should Narukami turn his attention towards Kumagakure in a less than peaceful manner. And pray tell why that is the case, he questioned his niece. Mabu just shook her head at A's irritation and explained, the jutsu requires not only a talent in lightning release, but an yin release as well. Seeing a begrudgingly nod his head in understanding, she continued, besides, a lot of the work is done by this seal. She then showed him the seal that was on the palm of her left hand before continuing. And I highly doubt there is a seal master out there that can replicate this. I don't even understand how it works entirely, and I was there when he made it. I'm just aware of what it does to help the jutsu. I examined the seal closely for a few moments before he released a sigh of surrender. I was never one for seals. And we don't really have many seal specialists in Kumo. I suppose we should just be thankful you even have the jutsu I suppose. Though now, after hearing the details of the jutsu, Narukami has established himself as a potential S-class threat and I had no choice but to treat him as such. He was reluctant in all honesty, considering he has done nothing to show dishonesty or malicious intent, but there was pressure for him to take action considering his position as Raikage. It was his job to maintain the safety of his village. He won't act against Narukami for now, but that doesn't mean he won't prepare for his betrayal. If he follows through on his promise with the phones, I won't have to worry so much, he thought. By providing such a powerful tool for Kumo, he would be building good rapport and a bond of trust with the village, making things much easier on A. A then returned to his seat, and folded his fingers together on his desk, but a promise is a promise. I'll have one of our Anbu inform him to come by tomorrow, so we can set up the details regarding his departure. Mabu rose her hand slightly and spoke up somewhat meekly, you don't need to go through the trouble uncle. I can stop by on my way home to let him know. I'm sure he'd prefer to hear it from someone he is familiar with compared to a stranger. Hearing Mabu say this was unusual to say the least. This caused him to raise a brow and ask, I have no problem with this, but seeing you be so willing is a bit strange. You've never been so proactive before, so what's the occasion? Hearing her uncle say this caused her to blush a bit and respond with a slight stutter. There is no special reason, I just thought that we could talk more about the jutsu before he leaves. While A wasn't the brightest of individuals, even he could tell what was going on with Mabu. Judging by the faint blush on her cheeks, and the slightly depressed tone she had when she mentioned him leaving, it would seem that his little Mabu has found a man that caught her eye. Now normally A would be against such a thing, and knock the daylights out of any guy who showed even a hint of interest towards Mabu. He felt that he could let this slide. After all, who wouldn't want to have their niece marry a powerful and unaligned shinobi like Narukami? Even if he has a mysterious background, he was strong nonetheless, and it would be a great boon to have him join Kumagakure. It would also settle the problem he had, with him becoming an S-class threat and all. The reason definitely was not because of all the paperwork he has been receiving for arranged marriages and love letters to her. Nope, that's not the reason at all, not one bit. Damn paperwork. At least there is no such thing as paper jutsu. Somewhere in a megacure. Achoo, sneezed a familiar, blue-haired woman with her hair held by a paper flower. This has been happening more frequently, she thought, referring to her random acts of sneezing. Maybe I can convince Nagato to ease up on the rain. Back in Raikage Tower. A shiver went down the dark-toned Raikage's spine for a moment before he regained his posture. That was strange, he thought. It was almost as if I jinxed myself. I also have a feeling that I wasn't the first person to feel this way. He broke this brief thought to return his attention to a more interesting matter. Noticing the signs, A grinned once more and let out a hearty laugh. Ha ha ha. It seems my little Mabu has finally found a man in her life. Hearing this, Mabu began to turn a darker shade of red in embarrassment and began to sputter and stutter nonsense. What? But no. We aren't like that, uncle. We just get along well. I couldn't help but to continue laughing at the strange scene before him. The usually calm and mature Mabu was acting like a sputtering, embarrassed teenager. It was a real contrast to how she normally acted. These feelings must all be new to her, since she never really showed an interest in the opposite sex until now. Could this be her first crush? Seeing a continue laughing, Mabu opted to stay silent before she embarrassed herself further, though a faint blush could still be seen on her now slightly pouting face. It isn't funny, uncle, it's not like that at all, she muttered a bit too weakly and unconvincingly than she would have liked. I just waved her off and said, all right, just be on your way. I want to make sure he has enough time to prepare before tomorrow's meeting, so get. Reining her previous fluster in, she bowed to him in respect. By your leave, Lord Raikage. As she turned to leave and opened the door, she heard a yell loud enough for the whole building to hear, and Mabu. Tell Narukami I approve. Lord Raikage. Stop it. Seriously, what is with everyone today? She thought before finally leaving the office. Kumagakure Hotel, Void State. The Crossing Heavens Jutsu. Naruto had taken part of the name from Mabu's original jutsu, and renamed it to something he felt was more fitting. Spacetime ninjutsu was an art that was much sought after by many nations, and it was the reason Minato Namikaze had gained his fame. The Hiraishin was a powerful jutsu that allowed him to destroy an entire army of Iwagakure. And now that Naruto possessed thorough knowledge of teleportation, he couldn't help but feel that it was flawed. In truth, Naruto was able to crack the code of the Hiraishin during his 5 years of training. He just refused to use the jutsu because of pride and how he felt that it was lacking. He learned the art of seal teleportation by studying the seal that was in the ruined library of Uzushiagakure, and he couldn't stand the prerequisites. While Minato put it to good use, the fact remained that if one was prepared thoroughly and had knowledge of the jutsu, it wasn't too difficult to avoid, reflect, or, in Naruto's case, negate. The Hiraishin relied heavily on a seal to act as a beacon. Wherever this beacon was placed, it would allow the user to teleport to. This was usually done with Minato's unique Kyune, but there were times he would place the seal directly on his opponent. One could say that Naruto was the direct weakness of Minato. As a seal master, Naruto was capable of scrambling the direction and accuracy of the seal, or dispel it completely as long as he was within reach of the seal. With Mabu's heavenly transfer jutsu, the teleportation happened without the use of sealing arrays, but it was limited to objects. The reason why this was the case was due to the nature of the jutsu. The heavenly transfer jutsu was a technique that teleported objects by breaking them down into charged particles and sending them away, similar to how electricity flows through conductive material. The problem when using it on living beings is that any living being would be killed during the particle breakdown process. Though it is a morbid thought, one could relate this process to chopping your limbs off, stuff them into a compartment, and then send them to another location, just on a much smaller scale. It is practically the same thing, and you would die before the breakdown could even finish completing. Even if your body is reconstructed from the breakdown, it is like someone just sewed those body parts back together. Even if all the limbs were reassembled, you died before the travel even began. So this makes one think, how was the Raikage able to bypass this issue? The secret lead in his most famous technique, the lightning armor. The heavenly transfer jutsu was a teleportation jutsu that utilized yin and raiden elements. When coated himself in lightning element chakra, he became one with the electrical transfer technique, meaning the breakdown wasn't necessary. They essentially become one giant charged particle, allowing a safer and faster transfer. It was also possible to survive the breakdown by having a regenerative ability that combated or surpassed the breakdown process, but it would be immensely painful to go through, making it an obsolete option. Now this leads us to Naruto's Crossing Heavens Jutsu. He combined the complexity and seal expertise of the Hiraishin with the flexibility and limitless potential of the Heavenly Transfer Jutsu as one to develop a unique jutsu that surpassed both. Instead of having a seal to act as a beacon like Minato did, it would act as the middleman, by performing the necessary calculations and formations to form a thin, practically unseen, electrical cloak that was similar but notably weaker, to the Raikage's lightning armor on the user. The seal would also act as a replacement for hand signs, and will be programmed and connected to the brain so that all one needed to do to activate the jutsu was to think about your desired location to transfer to, and it occurred. The Heavenly Transfer Jutsu will be doing the teleporting, so you only needed to have the knowledge of your desired location as a prerequisite. There were other things that made this jutsu extremely formidable and stronger than any other teleportation jutsu before it, but it required more training before he could use it effectively. In short, he created a way to teleport without the use of hand seals and tools like Minato's Kune. The Crossing Heavens Jutsu took away the weaknesses of the Hiraishin and Heavenly Transfer Jutsu, while retaining their strengths. Karin and Sai should be back soon, Naruto thought to himself. He wanted to be attentive for when they came so he could help them organize the supplies and prepare to leave for the trip to the island turtle. Taking a deep breath, his void state slowly began to diminish as his senses returned to him. As he opened his eyes, he saw a familiar, yet unexpected surprise. Standing at the doorway was a wide-eyed and slack-jawed Mabu, who was currently staring at Naruto, who had his real appearance in plain sight for her to see in all of its glory. "Narukami, is that? You," spoke Mabu with a hint of shock as she took in the appearance of the red-haired shinobi before her. While the color was the opposite of his original blue hair and he possessed what appeared to be whisker marks on his cheeks, his facial structure was the same from when she first saw it. His wild and untamed hair was also a dead giveaway despite the change in color, and after spending so much time with him over the past few weeks, she had grown accustomed to his figure and atmosphere. On an unrelated note, she thought this look was much better than his disguised one. As she continued to soak in his appearance, she froze, as if in sudden realization. Her eyes began to widen further as she thought, wait, he is a seal master, and has red hair? Could he be? Naruto's eyes began to widen in response as he soon began to realize his current predicament. She saw me, shit, and with my red hair, there is no way she doesn't know that. His thought was broken by Mabu's small exclamation of surprise, only to confirm his suspicions were true. You're in, Uzumaki. Hearing this, Naruto continued to sit silently with a whirl of thoughts and emotions happening all at once. What should I do? He began to contemplate. There were many things he could do to solve his current situation, and he didn't like any of them. I could seal her memories, he thought. But that would leave a large gap in memory, especially when they had just completed a powerful technique. He would have to seal the memory of everyone who knew about that technique, which would be close to impossible considering the person who was most involved other than Mabu herself was the Raikage. While Naruto wasn't exactly afraid to fight him, he doubted he would be given the luxury to seal his memories considering how fast he was and he had a cloak of lightning surrounding his body. As he continued to mull over his options, he felt a sudden chill run through his body and his consciousness begin to dull. Or, you could kill her. Upon hearing this voice, Naruto began to feel a sharp pain in his head that made him fall forward slightly and grunt at the unexpected thought that jolted his mind. Seeing Naruto in pain so suddenly, Mabu moved quickly to his side and asked, "Are you okay, Narukami? What happened?" Naruto took a brief glance in her direction, and immediately regretted it as the chilling voice in his mind increased in volume and pain. "Kill her, she is a liability, a loose end. You put yourself at risk for as long as she knows you're in Uzumaki." "Shut up," he retorted weakly, "she is a friend." "Friends? You barely know the woman, you fool. You think a few weeks of mutual interests and conversations qualifies you to have a friend?" Naruto proceeded to hear the voice laugh darkly in response. "What is there to think about? Kill her. You are plenty capable of escaping with your new jutsu. Kill her." Naruto's eyes began to darken as the words of the dark voice began to poison his mind. His body began to slouch over slightly in weakness, and his hands began to tremble. While Naruto would normally be capable of fighting of the dark whispers, he had just came out of the void state. That was another weakness. Your senses take time to return to your body, and even when they do, your mind needs to adjust itself back to your regained senses. Naruto was struggling against this darkness within him, and he seemed to be losing. Kill her. Narukami, will you be alright? Questioned Mabu as she noticed Naruto's complexion begin to darken. While she was distracted with worry, she failed to notice Naruto's hand clench and unclench in a fist, before finally settling into a plier grip gesture. Kill her. Mabu failed to notice as Naruto's hand began to slowly reach towards her throat and his muscles began to tense, ready to tear into her flesh. Kill her. Naruto's hand was only inches away from her now, and Mabu had finally taken notice of Naruto's hand. Naru, Kami, she spoke in worry and confusion as she saw Naruto reach towards her. But just as Naruto was about to commit an unforgivable act, a small whisper could be heard in the corner of his mind. The only spot that possessed some light. Trust her. It was spoken quietly, almost inaudibly, but that seemed to be enough for Naruto. The light began to return to his eyes, his muscles began to loosen, and the plier hand gesture changed into an open palm, gently pushing her away from him for some space. I'm fine, Mabu. I just came out of meditation, so I'm feeling a bit lightheaded. Mabu was by no means an idiot, and could tell that there was something wrong with Narukami. But she knew it was probably something that didn't concern her. This thought seemed to make her feel sad, for some reason, but she digressed. They sat there in awkward silence for what seemed like hour, but in reality was only a few minutes, not knowing exactly how to start a conversation after this situation. How did she even get in? I thought Karin locked the door. He then paused as he recalled exactly what happened. Ah, right. She was about to lock it, then Sai went and said something stupid again and got thrown through the door instead. I think I need a babysitter. It was Mabu who broke the silence first. So this is what you really look like, huh? I suppose it makes sense it's not easy being an Uzumaki. At this, Naruto simply sighed. There's more to it than that. There's certain people I don't want knowing about me quite yet. The disguise helps, but I'm pretty sure they have a rough idea about who I might be. He then looked into her slightly sad eyes and continued, it's not that I don't trust you, but if it was found out that you knew about my location, you would be at risk as well. I guess I can see that. But don't you think it's unhealthy to be holding back so much? It just feels so lonely, and painful to be so burdened. Naruto shrugged his shoulders weakly. You get used to it, but it's not like I plan to remain in hiding forever. Just until I become strong enough. Mabu then questioned, how long will that take? Naruto opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His mouth closed, and it wasn't until a few moments later that he responded in a detached and weak tone, I'm not sure. The silence continued once more until Mabu decided to bring up the heart of the matter. So what happens now? And there it was. Naruto reflected back on his options in his recent struggle with his darkness, and found himself troubled. Killing was not an option for him. And sealing her memories proved to be a complicated matter as well. It was then he recalled the last words he had heard in his mind. Trust her, he whispered internally, but can I? It was no secret that Naruto had trust issues, and for good reason. When he lived in Konohagakure, it was the entire village against him. One moment of trust could lead to disaster for him if he was betrayed, and Naruto never wanted to take that risk. So that begged the question, will he do so now? He will admit that he had become attached to her presence over the weeks they spent together, and even found her company to be more than enjoyable. She had slipped through the chinks in his armor, and somehow reached a point where he could consider her precious. Precious, he mused. Indeed, she had become someone important to him. Perhaps not at the level of Sai and Karin, yet, but it was enough for it to matter. He was also aware he could only remain in hiding for so long, and he felt 5 years has been a pretty good run for the most part. This didn't mean he was going to start showing himself to the world quite yet, but he supposed he could start with the ones he considered close. With that, his decision had been made, and said, nothing. Mabu gained a confused look on her face as she parroted, nothing. Nothing, he reiterated. But why? She spoke quietly. His identity is supposed to be a secret, right? So why is he doing nothing? Naruto answered her confusion with a smirk, because, I feel that I can trust you. Or did the time we spent together mean nothing? At that, Mabu became flustered as she tried to explain herself. Oh, of course not. It's just I thought, well, isn't it supposed to be a secret? Naruto rolled his eyes and said, I'm aware it is my secret, after all. She flushed in embarrassment as he continued, I'm saying that I can trust you to keep it, but am I perhaps wrong? Mabu responded with a shake of her head, of course I'll keep it, Narukami. I'm just surprised, is all, she thought. While she did open up to him when they were first meeting with each other, this is the first time he had opened up to her. It felt nice. Naruto smiled to her and said, then I see no problem. Oh, and when it's just us two, call me Naruto. Narukami is just an alias. She nodded her head, but paused as she pondered the name. Naruto, fish cake? She then looked at him in a deadpan stare and continued, your name is a ramen ingredient, seriously? Naruto just groaned in response, maelstrom, it means maelstrom, okay? I've heard that enough already, so I think I'll just drop the subject there. He then moved to stand up, but he still felt a bit weak from the void state, and fell onto his knee. Scratching the back of his head with a nervous laugh, Naruto asked, you mind helping me up? I'm still feeling a bit weak. Mabu simply smiled with a nod of her head, not at all. Mabu proceeded to wrap Naruto's arm around her neck and pull him up from the floor. As this happened, Naruto's body swayed into Mabu slightly, causing his hand to brush against her breast a bit, but it was enough to freeze both of their movements. Naruto turned to her a bit meekly with reddened cheeks and said, sorry, I didn't mean to. Mabu just shook her head lightly in response, and no, I know it was an accident. It's fine. The end of her sentence trailed off into a more hushed tone as they once more entered an awkward silence with flushed faces. Naruto turned to look at her, and found himself enraptured with her eyes. Mabu too felt entranced as she looked into the deep pools of cerulean that were his eyes. Before either could say anything or make a move, the silence was broken by an unexpected, pale-skinned third party, who proceeded to cough into his hand. Sigh. Ahem. I'm sorry for interrupting Nissan, but I felt if things were taken any further, it might get a little hectic, to say the least. Naruto was confused by the statement that was, until he saw the menacing figure of an enraged redhead that was standing beside Sai. Naruto gulped audibly. Hey Karin, are you okay? You seem a little tense. Karin's response was to drop the bags in her hands, crack her small knuckles slowly, and send him a smile that was a little too sweet for his comfort. Oh, I'm fantastic, she spoke coldly with her hair beginning to dance wildly as her fury began to reach heights that have never been attained before. Sai chose to remove himself from the room, an intelligent decision that many would agree with. Even Mabu, who had been holding Naruto up, moved away from him at the moment. Traitors. All of them are traitors, thought Naruto, before he tried to placate the angered Uzumaki. However, he wasn't given the opportunity as Karin continued, but you, she whispered darkly with a sinister giggle, you definitely won't be feeling so great when I'm done with you. Still feeling weak from his void state, Naruto could only think. Shit, the next day. Raikage Tower. What happened to you, brat? It's nothing, Lord Raikage. I fell down some stairs. Yeah. Stairs. You got nail marks from falling? And how does an S-class shinobi get injured from something so simple? Yeah, I call bullshit, thought the Raikage as he examined the claw marks that were on his arms, the rough engravings and dents on his mask, and his clothing which appeared to be mildly disheveled. After Mabu cleared up the misunderstanding yesterday, she informed Naruto and his group to meet with the Raikage to discuss traveling details. Of course, she only had the opportunity to tell them after Karin finished her fit of rage. I'm glad that nightmare is over, I never knew my arm could bend that way. She even used my mask as a weapon of all things. Naruto recalled from last night's events. He found that it was best to put such a memory to the side. Why was she so angry in the first place? Poor, dense Naruto, in time he will understand, hopefully. After discussing the length of time he will be spending over at Genbu and various other paperwork and details, the Raikage only had one thing left to do. I'm sure you can understand that despite what you have provided us with so far, I will need to have a team to escort you to the training field. Naruto simply nodded his head in response, already knowing he would have someone supervising them. He was still considered an unknown variable that couldn't be taken lightly. If he were in the Raikage's position, he would be doing the same thing. They all heard a knock on the door before the Raikage shouted, "Come in." As the door creaked open, the Raikage continued with a mischievous grin, "I'd like you to meet your escort team. They will be escorting you to Genbu and back, so do get along. They have very diverse, and difficult personalities, but I'm sure you'll manage. Naruto's eyes widened as he recognized the group before him. The boy to the left had a dark pigmentation with white hair, and a lollipop in his mouth. To the right was a wild, red-haired girl with sharp auburn eyes like a hawk. In the center was a opale-skinned goddess with a generous figure. He recognized all of them. Well, looks like this is going to be an interesting trip. Hey, it's the Shotokan. I stand corrected, this trip is going to be hell. Seas of Kumagakure wooden ship. It has been a tiresome journey, to say the least for the Team Samu and Naruto's group. It wasn't so much the walk or ship ride that was exhausting, in comparison to the company itself. There were few times where Naruto expressed frustration and hopelessness, and he has never been driven so far into a corner than he has now. How much longer until we get there? Thought a disguised Naruto, who was seriously contemplating suicide at this point. This whole trip to Genbu so far has been one annoyance after another. There have been few times where there have been moments of peace, and more moments of arguments and humiliation. Hey, Narukami, are you even listening to me? You're ignoring me on purpose. Like now. Please Karu, can I just have some rest before we reach the island? I've heard this story enough times that I can recite it word for word. What else do you want me to do? The now named wild-tempered and hawk-eyed redhead crossed her arms with AHMPH, and said, enough times for it to get into your head and fix the problem. She then extended her arm in open palm to a seated Amoy, who was casually enjoying a sucker until the attention was honed on him. All this guy eats are those damned lollipops because of you. And before Naruto could speak up, Karin came to his rescue, again, pointing her finger in Karu's direction before yelling in equal volume and fury, leave Naru alone, you red-haired banshee. Karu's brow twitched in annoyance, and spoke with her hands on her hips, why, hello kettle. My name's Pot. And we both have red hair, idiot. She then proceeded to cross her arms and asked, why does this bother you, anyways? It's not like I had beef with you in the first place. Just mind your own business. Rather than responding in anger, Karin just adopted a shy look with a reddened face, and spoke softly while fiddling her fingers. Well, a good wife always sides with her husband. Karin then entered her own world for a moment, before clapping her hands to her cheeks. Kaiwa. Don't make me say such embarrassing things. Karu didn't deign to retort to her words, opting to give Naruto a withering stare with narrowed eyes. I thought you said you weren't a lolicon, sigh. At this point, Naruto could care less about how they viewed his sexual preferences. If anything, he thought they were doing it on purpose for some comedic running gag they have going on between them. Naruto simply shook his head, and pulled out a scroll. As he was doing this, Karu and Karin both immediately became silenced and stared at the scroll with expectant, twinkling eyes. Seeing their reactions, Naruto sweet-dropped in exasperation before taking out with a puff of smoke from the scroll, 4 bowls of steaming ramen. I can't tell if their whole drama scene is real, or some ploy to give them some ramen. Seriously? They can just ask. Why make someone suffer in the process? Nearly as soon as the bowls of ramen revealed themselves from the puff of smoke, it had disappeared from his hands and were currently being devoured at an unfathomable rate by the 2 Uzumikis. If there was one thing that can grant him some moments of peace and quiet, it was ramen. It was at that time a stoic sigh whispered into the ears of a seated Amoy. They're just like trained bitches, aren't they? It was at this moment that Sai knew, he fucked up. It wouldn't be until later that day, when he realized the word bitch was a derogatory term, one that women find most unamusing, to say the least. Before Amoy could even respond, they felt that they had suddenly come under a chilling shade, which was in fact the 2 said bitches towering over them and blocking out the sun. When they turned their heads in a simultaneous motion, all they could see was overshadowed faces and a haunting aura. It was over a few minutes later. The girls can now be seen enjoying their bowls of ramen, while 2 mangled bodies were in the distance, seemingly consoling each other. With a swollen face, Sai voiced quietly, so, you have won too. Amoy merely nodded his head, riddled with lumps and bumps as silent tears flowed from his eyes. A bond of mutual understanding and brotherhood was born that day. Overseeing everything that was going on, Naruto could only sigh once more, these kids are going to be the death of me. He then turned to the last member of Team Samu, who had been quiet up until now, besides the few escaped giggles that had been released throughout the entire drama. You have my condolences, Samu. It seems we both are stuck with some troublesome brats. The enchanting blonde just shook her head lightly with a small smile adorning her face. The excitement is a bit nice, but I can see how it can be overwhelming after some time. Following her words, there was a short and awkward silence between the two. Naruto didn't really have much to talk about, and it didn't help that Samu was fairly quiet in general. In fact, most conversations between the two had been initiated by himself, rather than the other way around, but he chalked that up to just being a part of her character. It was during this silence when Samu spoke suddenly. "Thank you, Narukami." These words caught Naruto off guard and broke him away from his previous thoughts. "Thank you? Was there something I did?" Naruto questioned inwardly, but these thoughts didn't last long since Samu seemed to understand his confusion and clarified herself. "Whatever it was you said to Karu and Amoy, I think they've become much happier and relaxed now." Playing the fool, she knew exactly what he said to the kids when she stalked him, observed him from a distance. She didn't want to seem creepy to him, though she did question to herself why his opinion mattered in the first place. She then turned her body slightly in his direction, allowing him to view her tantalizing figure before she continued. "Amoy has started to try new things, and Karu has been less hostile and irritable towards others, and this only started to happen after they met with you not so long ago." She then sent him a smile more charming than she had ever sent his way before. It seemed so genuine and heartfelt that he could feel her appreciation in her words and actions. So again, "Thank you." There was something about her actions that made him feel different. If it were any other person, he may have just taken it with a grain of salt and said, "No problem." But the meaning behind every action varies between person and character. Throughout this short time he had spent with Samu, he knew that she was a calm and collected woman. She seemed to have everything in line, and he had yet to see her troubled despite the constant nagging and arguments of both their teams. Because she seemed so, dare he say, cool in nature, he thought he would be hard-pressed to even get her to pay attention to him, let alone talk to him. So, seeing her smile so kindly, along with her alluring beauty, Naruto's shell had cracked for a moment and allowed him to whisper a genuine thought, "Beautiful." Though it was said quietly, it was loud enough for Samu to catch, which made a small hue of red appear on her face before she looked away. It was a few moments later, when a smirk appeared on her face and she asked, "You find me beautiful? After all this time, I thought you had a palate for." She then sent a glance towards the kids, as if to symbolize something Naruto had caught on to quite quickly. The youth, so to speak. She finished with a light giggle, obviously referring to the gag about him being a lolicon Shotokan. A look of horror passed through his face. Not that she could see anyways with his mask on, before he seemed to realize she was just joking around. "Please, not you too, Samu, I assure you I have normal tastes." "Is that so?" she murmured with a slightly playful tone. "Then, would it be too much to ask what type of women you do fancy?" Samu would later convince herself that she had asked this question on behalf of her good friend Mabu. What? Of course she knew Narukami was the object of her best friend's affection. She would have to be an idiot not to. She was only suspicious of this at first, since there had to be a reason a mysterious figure like Narukami would be willing to stay in one place for so long. With how vague and embarrassed Mabu was talking about her crush, not to mention how jealous she got when Samu had told her how she would be escorting the mysterious mercenary to Genbu. All the signs pointed to him. It also helped that he wasn't exactly the most secretive person, and blatantly told her that Narukami was the one who was training Mabu. And though Samu had convinced herself that she asked for Mabu's sake, she did admit she was a tad bit curious herself. Just a tad, she thought. The question had stumped Naruto for a moment, as he himself wasn't sure how to answer. It was true he did find women attractive, but there was never a specific type of women that came to mind. Seeing as he couldn't think of anything, he was about to answer that he wasn't sure. That was, until darkness clouded his vision before an image of a woman flashed before him. In the image, he couldn't make out the face very well and the figure itself seemed to be slightly shadowed, but he did manage to notice some things about this figure. In a trance with glassy eyes that seemed to stare into space, he had blurted out, "Blonde hair." Upon hearing this, Samu found it very difficult to restrain a blush. She was completely embarrassed, and a little happy. "He isn't talking about me, is he?" Her first thought had been that she was his ideal. Completely forgetting that there are plenty of other blondes that exist in the world. She felt he was quite bold to announce something like that so bluntly right in front of her. And strangely, she didn't hate it. Unfortunately, another part of his sentence had broken her from her inner musings, and lavender eyes. Despite her resistance, Samu couldn't help but feel some disappointment upon hearing the latter half of his sentence, and also a bit annoyed. I see. Well, I should go check on the status of our location with the captain, so I'll be taking my leave, she said, trying to hide her embarrassment at guessing incorrectly, and feeling happy that she thought it was her he was talking about. Then I'll see you later, Samu, said Naruto, ignorant to her complex thoughts and finally recovering from his trance-like state. His mind was still fully enraptured in the figure that had appeared in his mind. He had never met someone that had those matching features before, so he was thoroughly confused. What was more odd, however, was how he felt warm upon seeing their visage, and felt a connection to them. I wonder who she was? From a distance away, Samu had looked back to Naruto, seeing he had adopted a pondering stance. Seeing this, a frown appeared onto her face slightly, before she turned away with a small mutter that came out unconsciously, idiot. Junbu Island, evening. It wasn't long after those series of events, that they had reached the landmass of a turtle. After a rather unfortunate run-in with a very hostile giant squid, the group was more than happy to find themselves docked onto the island turtle. They journeyed through the forestry on the turtle's back for a short period of time under the navigation of Samu and her team, with a few encounters with various beasts and other animal inhabitants. They were aggressive at first, but seemed to have recognized that Samu was a familiar face and an acquaintance of their king, Killer Bee. Despite the distance not being too far from the desired location, they decided to camp out for a night since the younger kids were exhausted from the trip. Though they have received a decent amount of training, their physique just wasn't on par with the older shinobi and kunoichi. The dinner was rowdy as always, but went by quickly with everyone leaving for their own tents for a good night of rest. It was later that evening as everyone was asleep when Naruto awoke to a voice. Ani wasn't surprised to hear from. Why? Spoke the familiar, ominous voice. It was a voice that had been appearing more frequently since his real identity was revealed to Mabusai. It's back. Again, thought Naruto as he massaged his temple, anticipating the headache that was to come. It had taken that moment of weakness he had to swarm his mind with sinister thoughts and suggestive, dark impulses. Why do you pretend to be happy? In truth, Naruto has heard these whisperings even while he was still training in Uzushiagakure, just not as frequently as they are appearing now. The voice would always question his actions, motivations, and thoughts, and while doing so, it had also tried to implant their own ideals. As a master of yin release, Naruto was heavily resistant to mental attacks, but this one was birthed because he trained in the yin arts, leaving him little room for resistance. The only time these dark whisperings had some form of success was when Naruto was at his weakest, which was after he had entered the void state. I'm not pretending, Naruto spoke inwardly in response. I am happier now that I have people who I can trust and cherish. You are naive, spoke the darkness that did nothing to hide its voice of contempt. After being betrayed once, I thought you would have understood that trust is a fragile and pointless thing to possess. Though Naruto could not put a figure to the voice, he could tell that it was shaking its head in disappointment. Well, no matter. I will be sure to show you the hate, the despair, the sorrow, you have been trying so hard to hide from. The voice then released a sinister chuckle as it continued. I will enjoy watching you crumble from this happy facade of yours into nothing more than a man of utter wrath that is overcome by rage and bloodlust to those who have wronged us. As the voice began to fade away, it finished with a tone of absolute confidence. I will show you the truth, and once you reach the falls, you can no longer escape from it. Shortly after hearing those chilling words, Naruto sat up slowly and exited the tent he had been resting in with his mask adorning his face once more. There's no way I'm going to be sleeping tonight, he thought before leaving the campground for a bit to get some fresh air, and calm his mind and heart with a cool walk in the night. It was a short distance later that Naruto began to hear crashing water, and came to the conclusion, a waterfall, is it the Falls of Truth? Were we really so close by? A bit excited at the notion of being so close to what he was looking for, Naruto rushed forward, and in less than a minute, he had entered a clearing with a small body of water with a waterfall rushing ahead from a small bar of land in the center of the pond. Naruto was absolutely mesmerized when he entered the clearing. But the reason he was so hypnotized wasn't because of the scenery of the environment. Rather, it was because of a young woman. A very nude woman, mighty add, that seemed to be bathing within the falls. Over the crashing water, it seemed she had yet to take notice of his existence, so she had continued cleaning herself in a calm manner. She combed the locks of her sandy blonde hair with her fingers, pulling it back to the side to reveal a slender, white neck and toned back that shone in the night. Naruto watched as her fingers danced along the contours of her thin, but well-fit body from her firm breasts, to her shapely waist, down to her long legs that glistened from the small droplets of water that reflected the light of the moon, granting her a fantasy-like beauty. While her proportions weren't as generous as someone like Samu or Mabu, she seemed very balanced in all the right places, defining her as an athletic beauty that was hard to contend with. He watched as she arched her back in a stretch, absorbing the side of her pearly back, gleaming brighter than the stars themselves, bent smoothly with little to no resistance. This told him that her body was very malleable and open to movement others may find themselves incapable of performing. Time froze for Naruto as he continued to bask in the glow of seeing such a scene, and it was during this time that the blonde beauty took notice of someone nearby. She had finished washing her body and turned to leave and grab her clothes, only to see a masked man not far from her. She stood there with a dumbfounded look on her face for a moment with many thoughts brewing in her mind, before her face morphed from her once unparalleled beauty into a scowl of contempt as she shined away. Seeing the blonde notice him and shun away from him, he became curious as to what he witnessed just now, and became slightly disappointed that such a fantastic figure had escaped his view. I wonder who that was? I'm pretty sure no one else besides the Raikage's brother and my group should be on the island. Naruto wasn't given much time to ponder, however, as a familiar figure flashed before him, trying to claw his head clean off his body. He flickered away from his position a short distance away, once more turning his attention towards the familiar blonde, who was now adopting a cautious and battle-ready stance. Who are you, pervert? How did you get here? Yelled the blonde figure that Naruto had seen before, but now fully clothed. Before Naruto could respond, the woman seemed to reach her own conclusion as her eyes narrowed in anger. You couldn't be here to assassinate me, would you? What? Naruto just looked on in shock, knowing the situation was rapidly degrading from bad to worse. He was almost positive she was angry because he was caught peeping on her while she bathed. And he was willing to accept the consequences for his actions, and perhaps even thank her for such a divine blessing. But how did the situation somehow devolve into assassination? Quick to respond and recover the situation, Naruto spoke. No. I'm here for a mission, not you. Why would I assassinate a woman as beautiful as you? Lay it on thick, thought Naruto as he recalled some words from Icha tactics. Women are less likely to be hostile when you compliment and flatter them. The small tip seemed to work as the blonde gained a blush and embarrassment, before it quickly turned into anger once more. HMPH. Flattery will get you nowhere. Well, so much for that, he thought briefly. Ya win some, ya lose some, I guess. While I don't doubt your lust, it is obvious you're trying to distract me. I know you're here to kill me. Figures, you idiots can't tell the difference between a kunai and the scroll it was sealed into. I didn't ask for this. What is she talking Abu? He thought, before he seemed to reach some sort of epiphany. No way. She's a Jinchuriki. As Naruto reached this conclusion, it suddenly brought out some bad memories from when he was treated as the Jinchuriki for the nine-tailed fox. A bit of darkness began to creep up on him, before it was quickly suppressed and extinguished. He began to sympathize with the girl before him, fully understanding the pain she must have gone through to act like she does. But, it seems her situation wasn't as horrendous as mine, he discerned after seeing her rebellious attitude and skill and speed, if her shunshin was anything to go about. If she experienced something similar to him. There was no doubt in his mind that she would either be dead, or become a lifeless husk of a human being that was better off dead, rather than becoming a trained kunoichi. As Naruto pondered, there was a small silence between the two which made the blonde assume that was his way of confirming her thoughts. I see. But it won't be that easy to kill me, she spoke in a serious tone and adopted a battle-ready stance, as her nails began to elongate and sharpen. Cats have 9 lives. And almost immediately, she pounced towards him with clawed hands and swiped accurately towards the base of his neck. Cat? Ah, so she has the 2 tails, Naruto concluded as he dodged her strikes with ease. He had to admit that she certainly was skilled in taijutsu, with a fighting style that did her bijou justice. She fought in a very feline style which made use of her claws and acrobatic skills. As Naruto watched her flip and move around quickly, he couldn't help but think, wow, she's very flexible, as he swallowed a gulp of saliva that built up from excitement. Her flexibility was something he had noticed from when she arched her back under the falls. It was hard not to notice the way her body bends and flexes so nimbly and gracefully. It made him recall her earlier nude state, and he couldn't help but reflect back to his books about various positions this woman would be more than capable of performing. It doesn't matter how stoic or collected of a man you are. Any real man would be aroused if they saw what he saw. He was just fortunate that his eyes, that held some lust, were hidden from the catty kunoichi. "Stop moving, pervert," yelled the kunoichi in irritation. While she was a skilled shinobi in her own right, and definitely above most shinobi among the Chunin class, Naruto was still a couple of tiers above her. Naruto was regarded as a genius that was greater than even Itachi, Uchiha and Kakashi, and began training earlier than she had. In terms of training, experience, and talent, she wasn't his match. This much was made aware to her as he continued to dodge slash after slash, and how effortlessly and efficiently he moved around her techniques. This guise is a lot better than the others that were sent, she thought with a click of her tongue. She then formed a hand sign before her lips, then multiple projectiles of blue fire took the shape of burning mice, moving to hunt down Naruto with undying persistence. Mouse hairball. As several mice aimed for Naruto's body, he made no indication of moving and simply unfurled a scroll he had sealed into his arm. Fire sealing method. In an instant, the flaming blue mice were sucked into the scroll with ease and disappeared without a trace, leaving a very wide-eyed kunoichi stunned. A sealing master. She thought in shock, quickly realizing this person was not some run-of-the-mill shinobi. He was a veteran in combat, and from the calm manner he pulled out the scroll and activated it with ease, it would seem he was very skilled in an obscure art. This made his movements more unpredictable, and harder to discern since she has no knowledge of seals, other than the one that is holding her bijou inside of her. She bit her lip in frustration, thinking, I can't beat him. Thinking this, she flipped backward a number of times, until she created some distance between her and the mysterious shinobi. While the blonde had paused her attack, feeling conflicted about her current predicament, Naruto was busy contemplating other thoughts. Blue fire, I see, so she's already started to master her bijou? Amazing. He couldn't help to admire her control of her tailed beast's unique flames, and adapt it to a fighting style unique to herself. This was not a simple task to do, especially at such a young age. His thoughts were broken once more when he saw the kunoichi extend her claws, preparing to continue this fight. Sigh. Naruto couldn't help but reflect on his misfortune. The woman before him seemed to have misunderstood that he was an assassin, out to kill her because she was a Jinchuriki, when it couldn't be farther from the truth. Though, a part of her aggression also seemed to stem from him seeing her completely nude. All right, so I'm not completely innocent, he voiced inwardly. But when you are presented with the naked figure of a woman that seemed to be sculpted to perfection, with all the right muscle tones and body measurements that complemented each other so well, who wouldn't bask in the glory? There was a tense silence between the two, both not knowing what to do in their situation, and before anything could escalate further, a deep, yet playful, voice echoed within the clearing. Yo, Yujito, it's time to go. The bee is not free, kitty, why so slow? Abruptly, yet comedically, the now-named blonde seemed to collapse in exasperation, embarrassment, and what seemed to be irritation as she seemed to recognize that voice. Does B-sensei not know how to read the mood? Meanwhile, Naruto seemed to be in deep thought after hearing that. Interesting, rap. B. He kept repeating that one word over and over, before he recognized the name from when he talked to the Raikage. That's right. Killer Bee is the sworn brother of the Raikage we were supposed to meet. Naruto's focus was then directed to a large splashing sound in the small body of water, and led him to gaze upon a bulky, muscular figure that was reminiscent of the Raikage. Like A, B had dark skin and whitish blonde hair, slicked back with a matching colored goatee. What made him visibly different was how more carefree he seemed in comparison. He styled himself with dark shades and 7 swords on his back, as well as personalized Kumo Shinobi gear, fitting to his personality. So this is the Jinchuriki of the 8 Tails, Naruto thought with deep respect for the man. He heard stories of Killer Bee, and knows that Bee understands what it means to hold a bijou inside of you. To be harassed and understand the pain of loneliness, but trudge forwards while earning the recognition and respect of his village. Perhaps, in another universe, Naruto would have been the same way. Earning the recognition of the village through hard work and perseverance, but the world isn't always so kind. But perhaps the biggest reason why Naruto respected the man before him was because he was the only one to succeed the trial of the Falls of Truth. A trial that cannot be so easily faced, and the primary reason for Naruto to come to Kumo in the first place. If there was anyone that could share their experience with the trial, it was him. When Naruto broke from his musings, he noticed that Killer Bee and Yujiro, whose name he had just learned, seemed to be talking, or arguing. It was hard to tell with how jolly Bee seemed to be, in comparison to the irritated Yujiro. During their small discussion, Yujiro had pointed in his direction more than once, with Bee sending glances between him and his fellow Jinchuriki. Before a look of understanding appeared on his face after recognizing Naruto's figure in the distance. It was a short time later that Yujiro seemed to have understood something and finally adopted a relaxed stance. Though, she still had a look of irritation on her face if her scowl was anything to go by. In the next instant, Bee hopped in Naruto's direction, startling him slightly with his speed, and because he was slightly distracted by the angered gaze Yujiro seemed to be sending his way. The swift and mighty Killer Bee greets the famous Narukami. It was a good thing Naruto had his mask on, otherwise his annoyance could be seen. Though he did respect the man, his raps were bad. They seemed too forced. And they were just bad. B continued with flailed arms and passionate fervor. I heard from Brother A about your stay, but I expected you to come another day. Hey. With a wry smile hidden beneath the mask, he responded, yes, well, I was a bit antsy to come here, so we did well on time. We planned to meet with you tomorrow. Boo it. He then sent a glance towards Yujiro, who was still boring holes into his body with her eyes. When she saw that Naruto's head turned to her direction, she turned her head away with ahmph. As you can see, I met your friend in, well, not so preferable circumstances. Killer Bee crossed his arms, nodding his head in understanding. Ah, that's how Yuji is, Yasi, serious in training, and times she's catty. Naruto could just see a tick mark grow on her forehead in the distance, and her irritation now seemed to be directed to Bee instead of him now. Ahem, yes, well, she definitely seemed well trained in taijutsu. It was very unique, something I haven't seen before. She was very fluid in movement, quick to strike, and he then recalled to how she bent and rotated her hips at impossible angles, and kicks that seemed to go past her head. Gulp, flexible. Yujiro was not very far away, so she had heard what Naruto said about her. She smiled when she complimented her fighting style. It was something she had created from the ground up to suit her abilities and make use of her pliable physique. It was one of the things she had the most pride in, and after hearing from Bee about some of Narukami's exploits, she felt that his compliment was all the more meaningful. That was, until he mentioned her flexibility. She knew exactly what he was talking about. The awkward pause, the gulp of the throat, and the way he sent her a meaningful glance was a dead giveaway. It also didn't help that he saw her naked. Oh God, she thought it mute shock. She had nearly forgotten with all the fighting in her blinding fury, that he had seen her, bare as the day she was born. Not only that, she recalled how long he stared at her. And thanks to a passive ability of being the Jinchuriki of the two tails, she was even able to detect a faint hint of lust mixed in. All Jinchuriki receive some sort of passive ability from their Bijuu. In the case of the Kyuubi, she knew that negative emotions could be sensed. For the two tails, she could sense lust. Something she wasn't too fond of having, but it had its uses. Now that the tension was gone and Narukami didn't seem to be an enemy after her life, all these thoughts and revelations have come together. Her reaction? To hide her now heated cheeks and turn away in shame and embarrassment. I can't get married anymore. Though she might not look like it, her heart was innocent in nature. She believed in saving herself only for the one man she loved. She was the kind of girl who indulged herself in fairy tales of romance, and that the purity and sanctity of a woman and their virtue was a necessary thing to find true love. But now that she was seen and defiled by the eyes of the man before her, what can she do? Seeing Yujiro blush and sensing Narukami's awkwardness in speech, Bee seemed to have come to an understanding about the whole situation. Slamming his fist to his palm in revelation and a smile on his face, Killer Bee said, "Ah, I see. You can't fool the eyes of the great Killer Bee. It seems there was more to your meeting than you made it out to be. He danced around with style for a bit, before closing in on the disguised Uzumaki. He then hooked his arm around Naruto's neck into a headlock before shouting, Yo Narukami, if you're a man of dignity, take responsibility, and marry the blonde Jinchuriki, oh yeah. What followed this statement? Silence. Not a sound was made as Naruto and Yujiro both froze. Bodies tensed and facial muscles twitched in shock and disbelief. How blunt is this guy? Where the hell did marriage even come from? Naruto was now at an impasse. Seriously, to take responsibility? Don't get him wrong. He felt that any man would be lucky to have a woman like Yujiro as their partner. From what he gathered in their fight, she was serious in training, and a very skilled kunoichi with a lot of potential to grow further. On the outside, she seemed to be stern and decisive, and perhaps a bit rash, but he could feel that there was a hidden gentleness inside of her, waiting to be understood. It also helps that she is a beauty to boot, so why the reluctance? Let it be known that Naruto would never force a woman to be with him. Not to mention that they had just met, albeit the abnormal circumstances. Relationships are not something to be decided on a whim, and though he was intoxicated by her appearance, there was more to a person than their looks. He understood this well, so despite her quality as a mate, time needed to be spent to understand one another. At this moment, Naruto felt that Yujiro would respect his thoughts and concern for the issue and her rights. This would then result in her rejection of the matter, and they could get on with their lives, but he couldn't be farther from the truth. Curious, Naruto turned his gaze to the catty blonde to see a look of determination. Determination? Why does she look? Thought Naruto briefly, before a look of disbelief marred his hidden features. Oh no, he shook his head in denial, praying to the gods above that what he thought was not happening. But it seems the gods did not favor Naruto that day. With a determined gaze, Yujiro turned her attention to the disguised redhead, and proceeded to make her way towards him. Killer Bee was simply standing to the side, watching everything go down with a smile on his face. Oh, he knew exactly how Yujiro would respond after hearing him say what he did. She was someone who would reserve themselves only for their chosen mate. And now that he brought her purity into question, she was left with one option. While it may seem a little forced on B's side of things, his brother asked him to try whatever he could to bring Narukami to their side. So given the current circumstances, he thought this method was within reason. As Yujiro finally appeared before Naruto, she grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, pulling him close so that there were only a few inches between their face. She was so close, Naruto would have felt her warm breath brush against his lips if it weren't for the mask between them. He would no doubt be aroused and tempted at the moment. If it were not for her next words, "You will marry me. No exceptions, shit."